Content warning. This episode contains detailed discussions of graphic true crime events, including sexual assault, the murder of a child, and state executions. The historical and paranormal material covered in today's case involves intense and sensitive themes that may be distressing for some listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. September 1954. Midnight air over Jefferson City is thick with humidity and the bitter smell of cheap tobacco. From the observation tower, the prison looks like a jagged limestone monster sleeping on the bluffs of the Missouri River. But tonight, the monster is awake. Open the file in this place, and the rap sheet reads like a blueprint for human misery. It's all there, black and white ink. You've got Depression-era bank robbers hiding out in the shadows of the yard. You got cold-blooded couples taking their final synchronized breaths in a smoke-filled room of cyanide gas. Deep beneath the floorboards, you've got men buried alive in windowless stone tombs, losing their minds to the absolute dark. You know, they call it the bloodiest 47 acres in America. It's a city within a city, running on a crooked currency of greed, guard brutality, and cheap human labor. You know, the state turned the last key and walked away from the racket in 2004, leaving the cells empty, but at least that's what they think. You know, in a town this dark, the dead have a habit of keeping the graveyard shift. And the walls, well, they're finally talking.
Welcome to Crypt Walkers, the podcast where the eerie and enigmatic come to life. Hosted by Ryder, a police officer and paranormal investigator with a lens for the unexplained. Open the crypt. Come take a walk with us.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another case episode of Crypt Walkers. My name is Ryder, and thank you for joining me as I walk amongst the crypts and explore the unexplained. Today we are stepping onto the bloodiest 47 acres in America to unearth the dark, heavy legacy of the Missouri State Penitentiary. Now, before we do that, I want to give you a quick heads up on how we're going to break this one down. The sheer volume of energy and history trapped inside this fortress is far too massive for just one night. So this is officially part one of a special two-part investigation. The inspiration behind this deep dive comes from our friends over at Haunted Soulz Paranormal, an incredible father-daughter team of investigators who spend their nights running ghost hunts and capturing jaw-dropping evidence inside this very compound. They've seen the shadows and heard the echoes firsthand. You can check them out in the show notes. To truly understand why this prison is so actively haunted today, we have to look at the human blueprints that built it. Because of that, today's episode is going to be heavily rooted in the deep history and the grim, cold-blooded true crime that defined these walls for nearly 2 centuries. We're going to look at the brutal penal system, the chaotic riots, and the infamous killers who earned a seat in the twin chairs of the gas chamber. So, we have a lot of dark terrain to cover, so let's not waste any time. Adjust your headphones, lock your doors. Let's dive right in, people. Jefferson City, Missouri. Today, the capital of Missouri, Jefferson City, is laid out like a classic Midwestern river town. It's built on a series of rolling limestone bluffs that rise sharply from the southern banks of the Missouri River. At the geographic and symbolic center sits the Capitol complex, positioned high on a prominent bluff to dominate the riverfront skyline and look out over the rushing waters below. Radiating outward from this political hub is the downtown district, a traditional compact grid of historic brick buildings, government offices, and local shops centered along the high ground of High Street. As you move away from the legislative core, the city transitions into tree-lined historic residential neighborhoods that climb up and down the rugged, uneven topography of the bluffs. The entire layout kind of feels intentionally carved into the landscape, with steep hills and scenic overlooks that constantly remind you of the wild limestone terrain that the city's founders had to conquer. Long before it became the political heart of the state, this rugged terrain was little more than a wild frontier outpost sitting on the edge of the American West. When Missouri achieved statehood in 1821, the legislature chose this specific geographic center along the river bluffs to construct a brand new capital from the ground up. The town was laid out by Daniel Morgan Boone, the son of the famous frontiersman Daniel Boone, and named in honor of U.S. President Thomas Jefferson. This, of course, was the man responsible for the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, the historic $15 million land deal with France that doubled the size of the young American Republic and paved the rest for westward expansion. The future state of Missouri was born out of that very dirt. By the time Jefferson City was officially incorporated, and the General Assembly finally moved there in 1826, the town consisted of just 31 families, a general store, a hotel, and a few scattered buildings. But its survival was far from guaranteed. For several years, rival towns fought bitterly to steal the capital designation away. Places like St. Charles, which had served as the temporary state capital while Jeff City's government buildings were being constructed. They wanted it back permanently. By the 1830s, the founding families of Jefferson City were kind of terrified that they were going to lose the capital, and of course every dollar that they had invested in it. Honestly, I can understand their panic. Other cities like St. Louis were far better suited to be the capital. St. Louis was already heavily established, thriving, and sat right on the massive strategic confluence of both the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And based on my research, other than being this capital of Missouri, there really was no other logical reason for Jefferson City to exist. It was basically stuck right in the middle of the state, and at the time of its founding, it was essentially in the middle of nowhere. The town was on life support. Then, in 1832, Governor John Miller stepped forward with a radical proposal. Build a state penitentiary in Jefferson City to permanently cement the town's position as the capital. It was this exact vulnerability that drove state leaders to take the high-stakes gamble, launching the construction of a massive fortress-like prison that would ultimately anchor the city's future in stone. Prison is born. By January 1833, the project was officially greenlit, with $25,000 in funding. The state even hired John Haviland, the world-renowned architect behind Philadelphia's revolutionary Eastern State Penitentiary. That's another famously haunted prison that we will one day cover on Crypt Walkers, trust me. He was commissioned to design this new fortress on the bluffs overlooking the river. But the ambition quickly outpaced the wallet, as most government projects do. By the start of 1834, the state ran completely out of money. Go figure. When construction sputtered to a partial finish in 1835, they only had one 40-cell block and a few small structures to show for it. Wonder where most of the money went. Anyway, to cut corners and save money, the prison completely abandoned its original plan for solitary reflection, and instead they adopted the Auburn system, which was a brutal model centered around forced collective industrial labor. The state decided the inmates would work to pay for their own confinement. Sounds reasonable? To understand the true weight of what was happening on that bluff, you have to visualize what this place actually looks like. This wasn't a modern prison of clean lines and bulletproof glass. This was a grim, imposing fortress constructed from massive blocks of rough-hewn, jagged limestone, which was quarried from the very earth it stood on. The walls were thick, cold, and completely unyielding. Designed to absorb the brutal Missouri winters and suffocating summer heat. The windows were narrow slits, letting in just enough gray light to remind you of the world that you lost. But never enough to warm the damp inside. It sat like a dark, jagged crown at the top of the river bluff, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the water below. It looked less like a place of rehabilitation, and more like a medieval dungeon dropped onto the American frontier. And in 1836, that dungeon was ready for business. The heavy iron gates creaked open, and the prison accepted its very first convict, a man named Wilson Edison, who was sentenced to 2 years and 45 days for stealing a $39 watch. With the turn of a key, the Missouri State Penitentiary officially became the very first state prison west of the Mississippi. The early years. Once the gates were locked, the Missouri State Penitentiary transformed into a literal engine of forced labor. Inmates weren't just serving time. They were forced to build their own purgatory, finishing out cells, leveling the rocky yard, baking bricks, and paving the entryways. Then, in 1839, the state took things a step further and adopted the notorious lease system. This effectively turned the prison over to private corporations. You can imagine how that went. Businesses paid an annual fee to the state, and in turn, they were given absolute control over the inmates. They were given slaves, essentially. It was a corrupt, unchecked system of legalized corporate slavery. It cost the state absolutely nothing for the upkeep, but it came at a horrifying human cost. Inmates were marched out to quarry jagged stone, bake millions of bricks, and literally construct the houses and government buildings of Jefferson City. So, in a way, Governor Miller's original prediction had come true. The prison was literally building the city, one brick at a time. But this created kind of a toxic rift with the local community, as one would expect, but not for the humanitarian reasons, which we would all love for it to be for. No. Free laborers in the town were furious because they were constantly underbid and put out of work by cheap corporate slave labor. On top of the economic anger, the townspeople lived in constant anxiety. Inmates were working outside the walls daily, and escapes were a routine, terrifying occurrence. But the deepest horror lay inside the walls, hidden from public view. Under this corporate bureaucratic system, human rights did not exist. Inmates faced freezing, unheated cells in the dead of winter, threadbare clothing, zero sanitation, and rancid food that was barely fit for animals. So, to paint the picture, let's just say that the maggots are there for the protein. And if an inmate stepped out of line, slowed down their production, or attempted to flee, the punishments were draconian and sadistic, not to mention even deadly. The prison relied heavily on the whip, using the good old-fashioned cat-o'-nine-tails, which is a multi-lashed leather whip that would literally flay the flesh off a man's back, thus leaving permanent jagged scars. For non-violent infractions, such as talking to other prisoners, because, by the way, prisoners were not allowed to talk. Ever. Not even to each other. Guards used the quote-unquote water cure, which of course sounds pleasant enough. This was an early form of waterboarding, just to point that out, where inmates were strapped down and had water poured directly on their faces until they're nearly drowned or passed out from hypothermia, whichever one came first. If a prisoner was deemed truly rebellious, they were cast into the subterranean dungeon cells of a hall. There, they were stripped naked, shackled to iron rings in the wall, and left in absolute pitch-black solitary confinement for weeks at a time, with nothing but bread, water, and of course, the rats. Now, this wasn't a correction. It was a calculated system designed to systemically break the human spirit. This sounds just like a wonderful place, doesn't it? Perfect place to go and hang out. Anyway, by 1854, the horrific abuses of the lease system could no longer be ignored. You think? The state officially suspended the corporate leases and took back direct guardianship of the penitentiary. For a brief moment, conditions inside slightly improved, but the relief was short-lived. Within a decade, the state's wallet was empty once again, which I said before, typical government operation. I digress. So, they were utterly drowning in financial costs of running the massive fortress, which by this time was covering 47 acres. Desperate for cash, the state launched the contract system in 1861. So, instead of handing over the whole prison to a corporation, the state kept control of the facility, but literally rented out the inmates like pieces of machinery to private businesses. Okay? So, it was basically the same old story of forced labor and human exploitation. Just wrapped up in a different bureaucratic bow. Typical politician stuff. And financially, it was still a complete total disaster. For the next 2 decades, the prison's administration fell into a chaotic, desperate loop. There was also this, minor thing called the American Civil War that happened between 1861 and 1865. More about that in a moment. In 1873, they tried to crawl back to the old leasing system on a 10-year deal, only for the contract to completely collapse and become null and void within a single year. Then, in 1875, they got the bright idea and pivoted back to a modified contract system. This time, they invited private enterprises directly inside the prison walls, basically saying, "Come on, guys, come on in," letting corporations construct massive factories right inside the complex. So for 40 years, the prison yard operated as a private industrial park driven by captive sweat. It wasn't until 1915 that the state finally slammed the door on private corporate contracts for good, taking full, permanent control over the industries inside the walls and ending nearly a century of selling human labor to the highest corporate bidder. So, going back to the Civil War for a moment. Okay? To truly understand the psychological fault lines that ran through MSP, you have to look at the bloody landscape of the state itself. Okay? Missouri entered the Union under the volatile Missouri Compromise. Basically, it was a peace deal, a highly controversial political bargain that admitted Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. It was a desperate federal band-aid that they say temporarily delayed the Civil War, but it left the state completely fractured. Even though Missouri remained technically aligned with the Union, the Confederacy recognized it as one of their own, pitting neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother in a bitter, polarizing feud. Naturally, that national powder keg bled directly through the prison gates. There was no stopping it. As early as the 1840s, the cells began to fill up with active abolitionists, locked away for plotting and executing Underground Railroad's escapes to help enslaved people flee north. I realize the way that I said that, it sounded like they were executing the people who were in the Underground Railroad. I did not mean it that way. I'll read that again. As early as the 1840s, the cells began filling up with active abolitionists, people who were against slavery. They were locked away for plotting and executing Underground Railroad escapes to help enslaved people flee north. Next time I will write something like that better. Anyway, continuing on, by early 1861, as the nation officially tore itself apart, the prison became a literal factory of war. Missouri's pro-Confederate governor, Claiborne Jackson, that sounds very Confederate, moved to arm the local state guard as a rebel militia. Almost overnight, the industrial workshops inside the penitentiary were converted to churn out weapons and combat gear for the Southern Rebellion. I want to take a moment and think about that for a second. you're going to have prisoners building weapons. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about that for a second. How did you keep them from not making a weapon that they could smuggle or something? I don't know. Imagine going to your typical prison today and being like, hey, I'm going to have you guys make AR-15s. And we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so the tides of war shifted fast, and by June of that same year, Union forces marched into Jefferson City. Let's just say they were a bit angry, and they seized the capital and established Jefferson as a military base. The inmates inside the walls didn't get to stop working, however. The regime just simply changed. With a new set of guards watching them, the prisoners were forced to keep manufacturing military gear, only this time, every bullet and boot was stamped for the Union Army. Again, I don't know if that was the best idea. I mean, with the weapons at least. Everything else, I can understand that, but... Anyway. By 1864, the federal government began using the fortress as a dumping ground for military and political prisoners, causing the inmate population to skyrocket. The prison was already routinely overcrowded, with multiple men and in separate quarters, women, crammed into cordwood into single suffocating cells. The sheer human influx of the war pushed the architecture to its absolute breaking point. And in the spring of 1865, out of the chaotic ashes of a divided nation, the prison was forced to expand. So, they broke ground on a massive, imposing new cell block designed to hold the overflow of human misery. This structure would go on to become the most notorious, active, and haunted building on the entire property, housing Unit 4. Executions at the Missouri State Penitentiary. For over a century, death in Missouri was a local affair. From 1810 until the early months of 1937, capital punishment meant a public hanging. Good old-fashioned entertainment, carried out by the local county where the crime had been committed. For prisoners held at the penitentiary, that final walk led them just down the road to the For the prisoners held at the penitentiary, that final walk led them just down the road to the Cole County Jailhouse in downtown Jefferson City. But in June of 1937, Governor Lloyd Stark signed a law that changed everything, centralizing the state's ultimate punishment and decreeing that every future execution in Missouri would happen behind the walls of the Missouri State Penitentiary. Yay! Okay, I guess we just streamlined the whole process. Everybody, instead of being killed in the counties, you're just going to be executed in the Missouri State Penitentiary. That'll solve it. There we go. Just 3 months later, the state legalized the use of lethal gas, making it even better, which was used at the time as a more modern, humane method of execution. I don't know about that, to be honest with you. I don't know about that. To build this new theater of death, because that sounds wonderful, the prison turned once again to its own inmates, forcing convict laborers to lay down the exterior stonework for a small, specialized brick building. Yes. For those of you who are wondering, there is a chance in which one of those poor individuals who was executed built the very device that did them in. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, inside they installed a Stark metal capsule manufactured by Eaton Metal Works, the premier provider of American gas chambers. That sounds like a great commercial slogan now, doesn't it? Now imagine playing that during the Super Bowl. Anyway, from 1937 to 1965, 38 men and 1 woman sat strapped into the twin metal chairs of that chamber, drawing in the lethal fumes of cyanide gas. Decades later, in 1989, the chamber was modified for lethal injection to claim its final condemned soul. When you look at the grand scale of history, Missouri was one of only 11 states to actively utilize a gas chamber during the 20th century. Today, only 7 of those original structures are known to still exist. And despite decades of fierce ethical debates and humanitarian criticism surrounding the sheer brutality of lethal gas, Missouri remains as one of only 4 states where it technically remains on the books as a legal option for capital punishment. But the fires in the furnace have long gone cold, and there is no longer an active operational gas chamber anywhere in the state. Although, I have a feeling if you were sentenced to death today in Missouri, and they gave you the opportunity, which I don't know if they do, but if they did give you an opportunity, you could theoretically say gas. I'd like to be gassed. In which case, the chamber might not be operational right now, but it wouldn't take much to make it work. I mean, all you got to do is fix the seals. Just saying. The small brick house on the prison grounds stands merely as a silent, terrifying monument to the 40 lives that ended inside its walls. Currently, the chamber remains open to people to tour and whatnot. At the moment, the state still owns the prison. They have sold off a lot of the land. One of the parcels of land is actually where that gas chamber is. So they're in the process of working with a bunch of historical people, whatnot, organizations, to figure out a way to properly move that building from its current location to another location on the prison grounds and completely rebuild it back to the way it was, as it is right now. But in the future, it's looking like it's not actually going to be where it was originally built. Not that that really matters. Because, I mean, I'll say this. I have personally been inside this chamber on an investigation, and for some reason, looking back at it now, I never sat in one of the chairs, which, if you think about it, the chairs are where the people died, not necessarily the building. So if the building moves and the chairs with the gas chamber moves, I mean, it's the gas chamber, okay? It's the same thing. I mean, think about it. Those chairs were where, for a fact, someone literally took their last breath. If you visit the penitentiary today, like I said, you are provided the opportunity to do the same. I mean, sit in them, not die. I should point. I'm sorry. You're allowed to sit in the chairs. You're not gonna be gassed. Oh, good Lord, guys, I'm sorry. You'll have to forgive me. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning and I'm recording this. You're not gonna die, alright? They're not gonna, gas you. I could just imagine, though. Hi, welcome to the part of the tour. Sit down, go ahead and close the door. Take a big breath for me. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not a laughing matter. Alright, I'm sorry. Whew. You have to forgive me. It's an instinct at this point. If you work in any first responder, whether it be nurses or dispatchers, police officers, firefighters, we're all the same. When it starts getting morbid, we start making jokes. Sorry. Anyway, we'll get back to it. Okay. So, moving on. So I'm not trying to get political, despite everything that literally just occurred, as this is still highly debated. I am a believer in the death penalty. I have the utmost respect for those who are not, because I can understand that. I believe that as long as the convicted can be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, I mean 100%, this guy did it, right? We all know it. 50 different witnesses saw it, whatever, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, all the elements point to, beyond a shadow of a doubt, this guy committed the crime. Or guy or girl, doesn't matter. I say this. But I also, as I say all this, I also must recognize the unfortunate likelihood that there were instances, especially in this case, in which innocent people were executed for crimes that they did not commit. If you enter the chamber today, there is a collage of mugshots on the wall. These are pictures of those who were executed there. Many of them are African Americans, and it would be ignorant of me to not assume some of these men, and an unknown percentage of them, were convicted simply because of their race. I'm sure the juries in those cases either heard confessions or were provided circumstantial evidence or whatnot that led to the convictions. But let's just say, and this is coming from a law enforcement officer, getting fairly serious now, especially during the old days, like the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, a crooked cop could easily get away with beating a man until he confessed. And a man, even one who is innocent, will tell you the sky is green or confess to killing his own mother, a murder that he didn't commit, just to get the beating to stop. So, I just wanted to point that out there, and it's something that occurred to me while I was standing in that chamber, and I'm pretty sure anyone who's ever done any research on the Missouri State Penitentiary would kind of come to that same conclusion. So, I like to think that the United States has come a lot further since then. I even like to think that the system has as well. But I don't know. I can only control my part in it. So, so I want to take another moment to step away from that, and just really talk about the weight of what we're discussing. So, I guess to clarify where I'm coming from. I am a Christian. I believe deeply in forgiveness, and for those of you who don't know what Christianity is or whatnot, the belief that if you confess your sins to the Lord and accept that, God's one and only Son, Jesus Christ, came to the earth, lived a sinless life, died on a cross for our sins, as the sins for all humanity, and rose on the third day, a pathway to heaven is open for you. You can be forgiven. That is my spiritual belief, okay? That connects really deeply with me on the concept of spiritual forgiveness. Now, for others, it may be something completely different, right? You can still be a moral person and not be a Christian. I should just point that out there. But for me personally, I do not believe spiritual forgiveness exempts you from suffering an earthly punishment if you commit a crime worthy of capital punishment. If you take a life in cold blood, and it can be forgiven beyond a shadow, and it can be proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you committed such an act out of sheer brutality or malice, then your life shall be forfeit. That is a sentence that must be carried out according to our society's laws. Okay? Key word in there is sheer brutality and malice. Meaning 100% you wanted to kill this person because you wanted something to gain, or just out of just sheer brutality. Walking up to some random person and just shooting them and walking away. That is... I'm not alluding to any case, by the way. I know that sounded like I was, but I wasn't. It doesn't matter. I'm bouncing all over the place because it's 1 o'clock in the morning. To sum it all up, for what I believe, God may have mercy on your soul, but the state and the people still demand justice. So every case should be weighed heavily and definitely not taken lightly regardless, okay? So we'll move on from all of that and kind of go into some of the cases that led to some of the executions. And these two individuals I firmly believe deserve to be executed. And we'll just dive into it. To give you a clear sense of the absolute brutality that I believe is required to earn a seat in that specific concrete room, we have to look closely at the evidence. So I'm going to take you through a case pulled directly from the historical archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is a file detailing the monstrous actions of Bonnie Emily Hetty and her lover, Carl Austin Hall. These two individuals would commit a crime so dark to which they did, without a shadow of a doubt, and with absolute malice, it would ultimately force them to take that final walk together. So it began on the morning of September 28, 1953, at a quiet Catholic school in Kansas City, Missouri. A woman stepped up to the doors of the institute, visibly distressed, and claimed to be the aunt of a 6-year-old, Bobby Greenlease, the son of a wealthy local automobile dealer. She told the nuns that Bobby's mother had just suffered a massive heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. It was a calculated, brilliant lie. When the boy was brought out, he walked straight to the woman without hesitation, completely trusting her. She placed a maternal arm around his shoulder, took his hand, and led him into a waiting taxi. Within 30 minutes, the school called the Greenlease home to check on the mother's condition, only to find her perfectly healthy. The panic was instantaneous. The FBI was mobilized, but the kidnappers were already moving. Hours later, the family received the first of over a half a dozen ransom notes, demanding a staggering $600,000 in cash, the largest ransom demand in American history at the time. To prove they had the boy, a later envelope arrived containing a small Jerusalem medal Bobby always wore around his neck. For days, the kidnappers stringed the family along with terrifying phone calls. At 1 a.m. on October 5th, they made final contact, assuring the frantic parents that the cash had been received and that Bobby was safe but homesick, and that he would be returned within 24 hours. But this was all a sadistic illusion. In truth, the masterminds behind the plot, a man named Carl Austin Hall and his girlfriend Bonnie Emily Hetty, had murdered the 6-year-old boy less than an hour after taking him from his school. Hall had driven the child just across the state line into Kansas and shot him in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. They then drove his body 45 miles back to St. Joseph, Missouri, buried him in Bonnie's yard, and cold-bloodedly planted flowers over the fresh grave before fleeing to St. Louis with the money. The law caught up with them just days later in a St. Louis hotel room, tipped off by a suspicious cab driver. On October 7th, FBI agents dug up the flower bed outside the Hetty residence, discovering Bobby's body wrapped in a plastic and covered in lime. When the case went to federal court, it took a jury just 1 hour and 8 minutes to return a verdict of death. The presiding judge didn't hold back, stating, "I think the verdict fits the evidence. It is the most cold-blooded, brutal murder I have ever tried." On December 18th, 1953, less than 3 months after the abduction, Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty made that final walk together into the concrete gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary. They were tied down side by side in the twin metal chairs. The cyanide pellets were dropped. Hall was pronounced dead at 12:12 a.m. Bonnie Hetty drew her last breath just 20 seconds later, becoming the only woman ever executed by lethal gas in the history of the state. So, to this day, a dark mystery still shadows this particular case. Over half of that $600,000 ransom was never recovered. The money vanished into the underworld, but the dark energy of the killers, of course, remained trapped in the prison. George Mercer's execution. If the Greenlease case represents the historical peak of the gas chamber, our next file represents the dawn of its modern replacement. For nearly 24 years after 1965, the execution chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary sat completely dark and silent. The machinery of death had stalled across the country. But on a sweltering summer night in 1978, a brutal outlaw named George Tiny Mercer would commit a crime so monstrous it would force the state to reactivate the room and introduce a brand new method of execution. Late on August 30th, Mercer, a member of a local motorcycle gang, was drinking with his friends at a lounge in Grandview, Missouri. He noticed a 22-year-old waitress named Karen Ann Keaton and coldly mentioned to a friend that he wanted her. The two had never met. Sensing an opportunity to please his gang leader, one of Mercer's associates, Stephen Gardner, lured Karen out under the pretense of getting breakfast, planning to deliver her to Mercer's house in Belton as a birthday present for Mercer's upcoming 34th birthday. When Karen arrived at the home, the trap snapped shut. Mercer drew a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun, forcing her upstairs to his bedroom. When she frantically begged Gardner for help, Gardner simply looked at the gang leader and muttered, "Happy birthday, Tiny." What followed was a nightmarish, hours-long ordeal where Karen was systematically brutalized and sexually assaulted by Mercer and his gang members, all while Mercer's 10-year-old daughter was downstairs, forced to witness pieces of the unfolding horror. When the assaults ended, Mercer and Gardner stood on the stairs debating what to do with their victim. Gardner suggested that they kill her. Mercer instantly agreed, bragging that he knew of an isolated place to dump the body where it would never be found. Mercer went back upstairs and manually strangled Karen Keaton. At one point, he called an associate up to check her pulse. When a faint heartbeat was detected, Mercer savagely beat the young woman while continuing to choke her until the last breath left her body. They threw her remains into the back of a pickup truck, drove out to a barren field in Johnson County, and dumped her over a fence. In a chilling display of sociopathy, Mercer later muttered that he wished he had murdered a 17-year-old girl he had raped weeks prior, just to beat the legal charges. It took nearly a month for one of the accomplices to break under the guilt, hire a lawyer, and lead the FBI to Karen's badly decomposed remains in that field. The arrest tore through the motorcycle gang. Mercer was put on trial for capital murder, and despite later claiming innocence and explaining a jailhouse religious conversion, remember how I said it doesn't matter if you believe in God? Great. You still deserve the punishment on earth. Anyway, whatever. On death row, his appeals completely ran out by the winter of 1988. On January 6, 1989, just after midnight, George Mercer made his final walk. The prison administration didn't use lethal gas this time. Instead, they had modified the old historic gas chamber, bolting a steel gurney directly into the center of the room where the twin executioner chairs used to sit. With his wife watching through the glass, the lethal drugs began flowing into Mercer's veins at 12:03 a.m. Witnesses noticed that he strained against the heavy straps, coughing violently before slipping into unconsciousness. At 12:09, 6 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. George Mercer became the very first inmate executed by lethal injection in the history of Missouri, and he was the last person to be executed at Missouri State Penitentiary. Other notable prisoners. The execution stands as a stark reminder to the nation of the ultimate price demanded by the walls of Missouri State Penitentiary. But, while the gas chamber claimed the lives of the condemned, the main population blocks were quietly harboring a different kind of darkness. Over its nearly 2 centuries of operation, the Missouri State Penitentiary didn't just hold those marked for death. It became a temporary warehouse for some of the most calculating minds, legendary gangsters, and infamous figures in American history. Men who walked these very catwalks, plotted inside these very cells, and left their own undeniable marks on the prison's legacy. Figures like the notorious 1930s outlaw, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, James Earl Ray, Robert Badella, John B. Firebug Johnson. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd. Long before he became a legendary coat-wearing public enemy of the 1930s, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd learned the harsh realities of the criminal underworld right inside the walls of Jefferson City. In September of 1925, at just 21 years old, Floyd was sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary to serve a 5-year sentence for a payroll robbery in St. Louis. The brutal, overcrowded conditions of the prison didn't reform the young outlaw. Instead, they hardened him, introduced him to a network of seasoned bank robbers and safecrackers. It was also during this time in Missouri that he allegedly earned his famous moniker, reportedly coined by a prison guard of a local mechanic who mocked his slicked back hair and neat appearance. By the time Floyd was paroled in 1929, he walked out of the prison gates not as a corrected man, but as a highly educated, ruthless professional criminal, ready to tear across the Midwest. Following his release from the Missouri State Penitentiary, Floyd's criminal career exploded into a violent whirlwind of bank robberies and high-profile shootouts that eventually made him public enemy number 1. But his run came to a bloody end on October 22, 1934. While on the run following the notorious Kansas City massacre at the Kansas City Union Station, Floyd was cornered in an open cornfield in East Liverpool, Ohio, by local authorities and a team of federal agents led by the legendary Melvin Purvis. Refusing to surrender, Floyd bolted out into an open field, attempting to use the stalks as cover as he ran. The agents opened fire, riddling the outlaw with bullets. As he lay dying in the dirt under an apple tree, his final words to the closing agents were a defiant refusal to give up his accomplices. He slipped into unconsciousness and died minutes later at just 30 years old, cementing his transformation from a small-time Missouri convict into an immortal legend of the Depression-era gangland. James Earl Ray. While the Missouri State Penitentiary held some of the country's most menacing figures, its single most globally infamous inmate wasn't known for his violence while inside the walls. He was known for his ability to completely vanish. His name was James Earl Ray. In 1959, Ray was a small-time career criminal who got caught committing an armed robbery at a St. Louis grocery store. Because he was a repeat offender, the judge threw the book at him, sentencing him to 20 years behind the walls of Jefferson City. Ray was a ghost inside the prison complex, constantly looking for a blind spot. His fellow inmates actually nicknamed him the Mole because he was tirelessly, endlessly obsessed with digging, climbing, or crawling his way out. In his first few years, he tried scaling the stone walls with a homemade ladder that had collapsed under him. A few years later, he managed to sneak onto a roof before guards spotted him. He even cut through a cell window and hid inside an industrial fan shaft an entire night, only to be captured the next morning. But on the morning of Sunday, April 23, 1967, the Mole finally found his perfect hole. Ray was assigned to work the early shifts in the prison's massive bakery. On that Sunday morning, taking advantage of a lighter weekend guard staff, Ray climbed inside one of the large, deep wooden crates used to ship freshly baked loaves of bread to the prison's external Wren's farm. Another inmate carefully packed the loaves over and around him, completely burying him from sight. A delivery truck drove into the yard, loaded up the heavy bread boxes, and drove right through the main gates. Somewhere between the prison walls and the farm, Ray burst out of the wooden crate, jumped from the truck, and ran. At the time, his escape barely made local headlines. He was just another small-time thief on the lam. But exactly 1 year later, on April 4th, 1968, the entire world learned his name. James Earl Ray utilized his freedom to travel across the country, eventually arriving in Memphis, Tennessee, where he pulled the trigger and assassinated civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When the FBI processed the sniper's nest across the street from the Lorraine Motel, the fingerprints they lifted from the rifle matched a set on file right back at the state pen in Jefferson City. Ray fled the country, sparking an international manhunt that finally ended at an airport in London. He pleaded guilty. To avoid the electric chair, he was sentenced to 99 years, and eventually died of liver failure in a Tennessee prison in 1998. It is a chilling historical reality. If a routine bakery truck had just been inspected just a little bit more closely back in Jefferson City, one of the greatest tragedies in American history might never have happened. Robert Berdella. While the walls of Missouri State Penitentiary held many men who committed crimes in the heat of passion or for financial gain, in the late 1980s, the prison welcomed a man driven by pure, calculating sadism, Robert Berdella, infamously known as the Kansas City Butcher. To the public, Berdella was a seemingly ordinary eccentric who ran a popular novelty shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. But behind closed doors, he was a prolific serial killer who turned his home into a literal house of horrors. Between 1984 and 1987, Berdella abducted, brutally tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men. His method was agonizing methodical. He would drug his victims, hold them captive for days or weeks at a time, and meticulously document their suffering in detailed logs and photographs before finally strangling them. He then dismantled their bodies in his bathtub, disposing of the remains in trash bags put out for local garbage collectors. His horrific reign of terror only came to an end in April 1988, when his 7th intended victim managed to escape by leaping naked from a second-story window while Berdella was at work. When the evidence was uncovered, the sheer depravity of his crimes shocked the nation, and to avoid the death penalty, Berdella struck a deal, pleading guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. He was transferred directly into the maximum security units of the Missouri State Penitentiary. But Berdella's time behind bars would be short-lived. He quickly became one of the most despised inmates on the compound. Completely isolated from the general population for his own safety, he spent his days writing letters complaining about his lack of proper medical care and psychological support. Then, on October 8, 1992, at 43 years old, the Kansas City Butcher suffered a massive fatal heart attack right inside his cell. Rumors immediately rippled through the prison yard and the media that his death wasn't entirely natural, with claims that inmates or guards had poisoned his food, or that prison medical staff deliberately ignored his medical distress as a form of poetic earthly justice. Whether by natural failure or silent assassination, the man who brought so much calculated agony to the world drew his final breath right there on the concrete floor of the Missouri State Penitentiary. John B. Firebug Johnson. While the 20th century brought infamous gangsters and ruthless serial killers to Jefferson City, the late 1800s bore witness to a man whose punishment broke every standard of human endurance. His name was John B. Johnson. That's a name. That's an interesting name. Anyway, John B. Johnson. But inside the walls, he would forever be remembered as Firebug. 1882, Johnson was sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary to serve what should have been the standard sentence for robbing an acquaintance of just $10. But Johnson was a wild, uncontainable spirit. He fiercely was determined to break free from his cage. It's stupid because he could have easily gotten... Anyway, I'll get into that for a second. He attempted to escape 3 separate times, but his final desperate gambit in February 1883 sealed his fate. Collaborating with 12 other inmates inside one of the complex's industrial workshops, Johnson set fire to the building as a massive diversion to breach the walls. The plan obviously didn't work. The prisoners were caught, and the fire quickly spiraled out of control, tearing through the prison's industrial sector, destroying over $500,000 worth of property, and tragically, claiming the lives of several trapped inmates. I should point this out. He went to prison for stealing $10. So, instead of just sitting in there for a little bit, getting that taken care of, he decided he was going to go ahead and start a fire that ended up killing a bunch of inmates. Which is way more than just $10. So obviously you can still get charged while you're in prison. You can get your sentence extended. Anyway, this Johnson guy was not the smartest light bulb in the box, but whatever. Brightest light bulb in the box. I told you it's 1:30 in the morning. All right, continuing on here. Let's see here. The administration's retaliation was swift, draconian, and deeply sadistic, and rightly so. Johnson was thrown into the pitch-black subterranean dungeon cells located deep in the basement of a hall. Okay, that's a little bit too much, but all right. This wasn't a standard solitary cell. It was a windowless, empty stone vault carved out of the rock beneath the earth, completely devoid of a bed, a chair, or a single ray of light. He was placed on a starvation diet, chained in heavy iron shackles, and left to rot in the absolute freezing dark. Prison records indicate most men cast into the deep dark of a hall either died of disease or went completely insane within weeks. But Firebug, this little bugger, didn't die. He didn't break. He was thrown into that underground abyss in February of 1883, and he wasn't let out until July 1st, 1900. For over 17 consecutive years, John B. Johnson lived buried alive in a pitch-black tomb beneath the prison floor. When he was finally released from the gates, having served a total of 18 years for a $10 robbery, he traveled from town to town, sharing his survival story and publishing a legendary memoir titled Buried Alive for 18 Years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. It stands as the record for the longest stretch of solitary confinement in the history of the facility. A testament to a mind that refused to break and a reminder of the sheer volume of psychological torment trapped in the deep, dark foundation of the bloodiest 47 acres in America. The Riot of 1954. Now, whether they were Depression-era bank robbers, civil rights assassins, or depraved serial killers, the names that echoed through the cells of MSP all shared one thing in common. They were contained by a system that was fundamentally broken. By the middle of the 20th century, the prison had become an absolute pressure cooker. Over 2,500 inmates were packed into an architecture built for a fraction of that number, crammed up to 6 men deep into tiny, unheated cells. The conditions were repeatedly described by investigators as deplorable. Fueled by subhumane sanitation, rancid food, and severe guard brutality, the atmosphere, of course, wasn't just tense, it was absolutely toxic. And on the evening of September 22nd, 1954, the bloodiest 47 acres in America finally exploded into an all-out war. I just want to point out I'm noticing a lot of stuff happens in September. Sorry. ADHD. It began at approximately 6:30 p.m. inside E Hall, a building used to segregate the prison's most volatile and incorrigible inmates. A 19-year-old prisoner named William DeLapp called out to a pair of guards, claiming that a broken pipe had flooded his cell and left him feeling intensely sick. It was a classic, devastating ruse, and the moment the guards stepped inside the cell to investigate, they were violently ambushed, overpowered, and beaten. The inmates stripped the keys from their belts, bolted out into the corridors, and began systematically unlocking every cell block in their path. Within an hour, a wave of pure, unbridled chaos broke out across the compound, as nearly 2,500 inmates flooded onto the yard, completely outnumbering the prison staff. As the night wore on, the riot transformed into a multi-million-dollar inferno. Inmates armed themselves with sledgehammers, iron pipes, and heavy machinery parts filed down into razor-sharp shivs. They smashed their way into the prison's infrastructure, deliberately setting fire to the complex. The recreation building, the vocational school, the tobacco shop, the license plate factory, and the grand dining hall were all engulfed in towering flames, lighting up the Jefferson City night sky. But the rioters weren't just destroying property. They were hunting down their own. A heavily armed contingent of inmates marched directly towards housing units B and C, targeting death row and segregation cells to settle old, bloody scores. Armed with a sledgehammer, they smashed through a protective wall to reach an inmate named Walter Lee Donnell, who was locked in solitary confinement. Donnell was dragged from his cell, brutally tortured, and battered to death beyond recognition. In the very next cell, another target, James Crichton, barely survived by desperately jamming his cell lock with cardboard matches and paper, forcing his attackers to frantically stab at him through the iron bars with a sharpened broom handle. By midnight, the governor had mobilized a massive, terrifying show of force. Nearly 500 heavily armed law enforcement officers, including the Missouri State Highway Patrol, the National Guard, and police departments from St. Louis and Kansas City, completely surrounded the burning fortress. The next morning, a strike team of state troopers, armed to the teeth with riot guns and submachine guns, breached the barricaded cell blocks. When the final group of rioters refused to surrender and lunged at the officers, a trooper fired a fatal shot, instantly dropping the ringleader. At that moment, an eerie, sudden silence fell over the entire 4-story stone building. The remaining inmates retreated into their cells, and the heavy iron doors were slammed shut. When the smoke finally cleared, the toll was staggering. 4 inmates were dead, more than 50 people were severely injured, and the prison sustained over $5 million in damages. Yet, despite the complete collapse of security, not a single prisoner managed to escape the walls. The 1954 riot permanently solidified the prison's terrifying reputation, leaving behind a deep, lingering layer of violent trauma that many believe remains permanently embedded within the cold limestone ruins today. The closure of the pen. The scarred walls and charred brick left behind by the 1954 riot served as a permanent grim reminder that the Missouri State Penitentiary was operating on borrowed time. For the next 50 years, the state attempted to patch over a leaking ship, struggling against the relentless tide of shifting modern penal standards, crumbling stone infrastructure, and a reputation for violence that never truly faded. The machine that had dominated the Jefferson City landscape since 1836 was simply too old, too brutal, and too costly to maintain. Finally, in September of 2004, exactly 50 years after the sky burned during the Great Riot, the heavy iron keys turned for the very last time, and after 160 years of continuous agonizing operation, the inmates were transferred to a modern facility. The heavy steel gates were permanently chained, and the bloodiest 47 acres in America fell silent. When the prison opened, Andrew Jackson was president. The battle at the Alamo was actively occurring. The prison was open during the entire operating span of Alcatraz, the infamous island prison in San Francisco, California. The prison was officially dead, leaving behind only the cold limestone, the deep historical scars, and the lingering echoes of the thousands of souls who had passed through its gates. One of the fascinating things about the paranormal community is everyone has a story. Listener files are officially back here on Crypt Walkers, and I want to tell your story. If you've had a brush with the unexplained, seen something that defies rationale, or experienced something spooky, email me at contact@cryptwalkers.net. Just make sure to put listener file in the subject line, and let me know how you want to be credited, whether it's your real name, a pseudonym, or if you prefer to remain completely anonymous. I don't know, man. It's your story. I'm just here to tell it. Now, back to the show. The prison finds new life. When the final inmates were moved out in 2004, the massive compound didn't just disappear. For a few years, it sat as a sprawling, decaying ghost town right in the middle of Jefferson City. A silent concrete island behind razor wire. But city leaders and preservationists realize that while the prison's operational life was over, its gripping dark history was an immense asset. In 2009, the gates were unlocked once again, just 5 years after closing. Not to cage the living, but to invite the public inside. The Jefferson City Convention and Visitors Bureau took over management of the site, transforming the decommissioned fortress into one of the premier historical and dark terrorism landmarks in the United States. Today, MSP operates a highly active living museum. Visitors from all over the world walk through the towering stone arches to take guided historical tours, stepping inside the actual cell blocks that held Pretty Boy Floyd and James Earl Ray, and standing inches away from the twin metal chairs inside the infamous gas chamber. But as the sun sets over the Missouri River, the energy shifts. The daytime history tours give way to intense overnight paranormal investigations. Because when a single location absorbs nearly 2 centuries of human suffering, violent riots, and state executions, the walls don't just hold history. They hold echoes. It has become a magnet for ghost hunters and researchers desperate to catch a glimpse of what remains. The hauntings at MSP. The sheer volume of human misery, violent trauma, and sudden death embedded within the limestone walls has earned the Missouri State Penitentiary a reputation as, of course, one of the most actively haunted locations in the United States. Tour guides, overnight investigators, and even skeptical city employees have reported a staggering array of paranormal activity that seems to increase the deeper you venture into the Comptown. Straight out of Comptown, folks, comes a ghost with attitude. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. It is now, 2 o'clock? Who knows? I'm going to read that again. I'm reading my own writing, folks. All right. That seems to increase the deeper you venture into the compound. There we go. The energy here isn't subtle. It manifests as heavy, oppressive atmospheric shifts. These are phantom footsteps echoing down empty metal catwalks, and the unmistakable sound of heavy iron doors slamming shut on their own when no one is around. I'm just going to say I've seen some videos online where you hear that happening, and it's kind of freaky. But anyway, among the most universally feared sectors of the property is Housing Unit 4. This is the massive multi-tiered cell block built right after the Civil War. It is here that visitors frequently encounter shadow people. That sounds unsettling. These are pitch-black human silhouettes that dart between cells or peer over the top of guardrails. Investigators have captured distinct electronic voice phenomena, which are EVPs, in this particular building, ranging from desperate disembodied whispers begging for help to aggressive foul-mouthed growls ordering people to get out. The overwhelming feeling of being watched by an unseen hostile presence makes Housing Unit 4 a centerpiece for overnight lock-ins. Descending into the basement of A Hall, investigators enter the literal and figurative underworld of the prison. The subterranean dungeon cells where John B. Firebug Johnson spent over 17 years in pitch-black solitary confinement. In this subterranean abyss, the haunting takes on a deeply psychological weight. People standing in the absolute darkness of the dungeon frequently report an overwhelmingly sense of dread, sudden drops in temperature that leave frost on one's breath, and the sensation of being touched or scratched by unseen hands. It is widely believed that the centuries of forced isolated madness in these stone vaults left behind a permanent residual stain that refuses to dissipate. The small brick house containing the infamous gas chamber holds a different, deeply mournful type of spiritual residue. In this room, where 39 men and 1 woman drew their final agonizing breaths, witnesses have reported smelling the sharp chemical odor of almond-scented cyanide fumes out of nowhere. Ghost hunters who use specialized audio equipment often record the haunting, rhythmic sounds of heavy gasping, choking, and a metallic clanking of execution straps straining against the journey. Wow. I said journey. Gurney. Against the gurney, not the journey. The spirit of Bonhettie, the only woman executed in the chamber, is said to still linger near the glass viewing windows, because that's just creepy, forever trapped in the final seconds of her earthly judgment. Serves her right. While shadow figures and disembodied groans are staple terrors of the paranormal world, the Missouri State Penitentiary harbors a much rarer, deeply insidious entity. Reports of a doppelganger. In the realm of high-level paranormal research, a doppelganger isn't just a random ghost. It is a deceptive mimic spirit that manifests by perfectly copying the physical appearance of a living person currently residing inside the building. At MSP, multiple tour guides and overnight investigators have encountered and recounted the chilling experience of catching a glimpse of a teammate or fellow investigator walking down a distant catwalk or ducking into a cell block, only to turn around and find that exact same person standing right next to them. This isn't a mere trick of the light. It is a calculated visual manipulation that leaves seasoned ghost hunters completely paralyzed with confusion. Now, there is a reason why I put that particular paragraph in this case. I can't wait to tell you in part 2, but I had my own doppelganger encounter, and I didn't even know what the heck a doppelganger even was when I was there. So, anyway, I found a whole bunch of research after I went to MSP and heard about the doppelganger, and I was like, wow, this is an actual thing. Anyway, continuing on, this particular phenomenon is so prominent that it drew the renowned Atlantic Paranormal Society, TAPS, back to the prison for a highly publicized investigation, of course, because it's a TV show. Skeptics often try to dismiss these sightings as simple exhaustion or misidentification in the dark, but the consistency of the witness tells a different story. I call bullcrap. Anyway, to see an entity that looks like a stranger is frightening, but to stand in the pitch-black corridors of Housing Unit 4 and look across the tier at a perfect silent mirror image of yourself or your partner touches on a primal level of horror. Many researchers believe that this mimicry is a form of negative intelligent energy, drawing from the collective decades of deception, paranoia, and identity loss experimented by thousands of men who were stripped of their names and reduced to mere numbers behind these walls. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of MSP's hauntings comes from the physical encounters reported by staff and guests alike. People have had their clothes tugged, equipment batteries instantly drained to zero even though they're fully charged, and have even seen full-bodied apparitions of men in vintage prison uniforms walking across the yard before vanishing into solid limestone walls. Whether these phenomena are intelligent spirits trying to communicate, or simply a massive tape recorder, effect of history permanently burned into the quarried stone, one thing is certain. When the lights go out on the bluffs of Jefferson City, the bloodiest 47 acres in America are anything but empty. There is so much to dig in here, and in part 2, when Dan and Madie of Haunted Soulz Paranormal comes on to share their experiences, you'll hear for yourself some of these very real accounts, from full-bodied apparitions to dark shadowed figures. And like I said, I even have a doppelganger story of my own, which I am, of course, choosing to share in part 2 instead of part 1. This case has been perhaps the biggest case I have covered, as it has so much history, and trust me, I am leaving a lot out. So I encourage you guys to also, do some exploring on your own. But I appreciate you guys sticking with me through it. I promise part 2 is going to be nothing but paranormal filled. So, to wrap up, as the heavy iron gates of the Missouri State Penitentiary slam shut behind us, we are left to look up at the silent, jagged limestone bluffs of Jefferson City with a profound sense of gravity. For nearly 2 centuries, this fortress stood as a monument to society's deepest fractures. It was a 47-acre crucible that bore witness to the shifting politics of a nation, the brutal realities of frontier justice, and the darkest, most calculating depths of human behavior. From the chaotic fires of 1954 to the stark, chilling science of the twin-chair gas chamber, the history of MSP is not just a collection of dates and names. Our journey through the shadows of Jefferson City is only halfway over. Now that we understand the brutal architecture and the violent history that built the foundation of this particular prison, we must face the terrifying reality of what still lingers within its walls today. I am choosing to bypass any housekeeping for this episode since it is so long already. Instead, I will provide any housekeeping items in part 2. If you guys want to help us out and help us keep deep diving into these darkest corners of history and true crime and the paranormal, please hit that subscribe button. Leave us a 5-star review and share this episode with your fellow true crime or paranormal enthusiast fan. Trust me, we need all the interesting, crazy people we got. Please do leave us a review. Believe it or not, it really helps us grow. Even if it's like, I love the work, or I hate the work, or this dude's voice is annoying. Really, any review is great. It shows that we're getting reviews. So, anyway, you can follow us on social media by clicking the link tree in the show notes. I am excited, again, to say that I have Haunted Soulz Paranormal on for part 2, and I have a feeling that you will definitely enjoy hearing what Dan and Madie have to bring to the table. You can check out their podcast by clicking the link in the show notes as well. Now, stick around for the trailer for part 2, and you'll actually get to hear a little bit of Dan and Madie in there. And, of course, until next week, Ryder out.
Next time on Crypt Walkers.
In part 1 of our deep dive into the Missouri State Penitentiary, we uncovered the brutal history of America's bloodiest 47 acres, mapping out the violent riots, the executions, and the sheer body count left behind. But we only scratched the surface of what still lingers inside those dark cell blocks. This is part 2. We are leaving the archives and walking directly into the crypts to explore this very active location with Dan and Madie from Haunted Soulz Paranormal. The father-daughter duo are 2 seasoned investigators who have experienced the first-hand terror of MSP's paranormal reality. Because when you descend into the subterranean dark of the prison, the atmosphere changes from an empty museum to something else.
Everyone else stays back here, and they send you down there to see if they can see shadows walking or if they see anything. And they were sending people down. And I just got this immense fear. Like, I wanted to cry. Now, for all those people who know me, I'm the scaredy pants of our team. But this was when I was brave. This was like my second time being there. I was brave. I was walking down and I was like, it was the same thing. I felt those eyes. Like, they were watching me and they were like, oh, who is this little lady being here? Like, the weirdest feelings you get down there, it's undescribable unless you've felt it.
But it isn't just the modern investigators who catch these anomalies. The shadows have been pacing these catwalks since the cells were full.
And we were like, well, did you see anything? Have you ever seen an apparition? Have you seen things? He's like, well, one night I was laying in bed and he goes, I heard somebody walking. I saw this prisoner walk across my cell in front, outside in the hallway. He said he was wearing prison stripes. I said, stop right there. Don't say nothing else. And I got my phone and I showed him my picture and he's like, yeah, that's the guy. And he actually saw the same, exactly same guy with the hat, everything, and stripes. He was sitting in his cell.
The inmates left. The guards went home. The gas chamber remained silent. But the prison never truly emptied. Part 2 of the Missouri State Penitentiary with Haunted Soulz Paranormal airs Wednesday, July 8th, wherever you get your podcasts.